Ever wonder why Resident Evil sticks with you long after the credits roll, leaving a lingering sense of unease that isn't just about gore? It's not simply the zombies, it's a meticulously crafted psychological assault. We're breaking down the hidden neuroscience behind the dread, revealing how sound, space, and scarcity twist your mind into a constant state of terror. Remember that feeling of constant dread creeping up on you while playing Resident Evil, even when nothing was happening? That persistent anxiety isn't accidental. The series employs precise psychological tactics, from suffocating level design to agonizing resource management, engineering a specific sustained feeling of terror deep within your mind. This isn't about jump scares. This is about something far more insidious, something that burrows into your subconscious and refuses to leave. Forget everything you think you know about horror games. Resident Evil doesn't just scare you, it psychologically breaks you, but not with cheap jump scares. We're exposing the scientific blueprint behind its unique brand of sustained terror, delving into how its brilliant design directly manipulates your brain to create an enduring, unsettling fear that few other games achieve. The most powerful weapon in Resident Evil's arsenal isn't the shotgun or the grenade launcher, it's silence. The series understands something fundamental about human psychology that many horror experiences miss entirely. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines, constantly scanning our environment for threats. When we're denied the information we need to assess danger, our minds fill in the blanks with our worst fears. Resident Evil exploits this mercilessly. Consider the opening moments of the original Resident Evil. You enter the Spencer mansion, and the first thing that strikes you isn't visual. It's auditory absence. The oppressive quiet makes you hypersensitive to every creak of the floorboards beneath your feet, every distant thud from somewhere deep in the building's shadowy recesses. This isn't accidental. The sound designers deliberately created a sonic vacuum, knowing that your brain would compensate by amplifying every tiny noise into a potential threat signal. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. Our auditory processing operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The conscious mind evaluates sounds we can clearly identify, categorizing them as safe or dangerous based on experience. But there's a deeper, more primitive layer of processing happening in the amygdala, the brain's fear center. This ancient structure responds to ambiguous sounds, uncertain threats, with a flood of stress hormones. When Resident Evil strips away the constant audio feedback we're accustomed to in daily life, it forces this primal system into overdrive. The distant groan of a zombie becomes psychologically devastating precisely because of what comes before it. You've been walking through silent corridors for minutes, your nervous system gradually winding tighter and tighter. Then you hear it. A low, guttural moan from somewhere you can't quite pinpoint. The sound itself isn't particularly loud or jarring, but your hypervigilant state transforms it into a psychological hammer blow. Your heart rate spikes, adrenaline floods your system, your pupils dilate, all from a sound that in isolation might barely register. This is the genius of Resident Evil's audio design. It doesn't rely on sudden loud noises to startle you, though it certainly uses those strategically. Instead, it creates an ecosystem of subtle, anxiety-inducing sounds that keep your threat detection systems permanently activated. The shuffle of feet on concrete barely audible through a door, the scrape of claws on wood, distant but approaching, the wet organic sounds of something feeding, heard but not seen. Each of these triggers a cascade of neurological responses designed to prepare your body for immediate action. The sound designers understood that our hearing is directional but imperfect. We're reasonably good at identifying sounds in front of us, but our ability to locate threats behind us or above us is significantly compromised. Resident Evil exploits this relentlessly. How many times have you spun your camera frantically, trying to locate the source of that dragging sound, that whispered breath, that clicking chitinous movement? The games deliberately place audio cues in positions that maximize spatial uncertainty, forcing you to expose yourself to danger just to identify where the threat is coming from. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated element of Resident Evil's sound design is its use of what we might call negative space in audio. Just as visual artists use empty space to create composition and focus, the series uses silence to make sound more impactful. When you finally encounter an enemy after minutes of tension-building quiet, the sudden cacophony of combat, the groans and gunshots and breaking furniture, hits with overwhelming intensity. Your nervous system, wound tight by prolonged anticipation, releases that accumulated tension in a rush that's both terrifying and paradoxically almost relieving. This creates a psychological pattern that keeps players perpetually off balance. The silence becomes almost unbearable, so you almost want to encounter something, anything, to break the tension. But when you do, the reality of combat is so viscerally unpleasant that you immediately crave the return of silence. This push-pull dynamic keeps your stress response oscillating, never allowing you to settle into either complete relaxation or sustained high alert. It's psychological torture, expertly calibrated. The save room theme represents perhaps the most brilliant manipulation of all. After enduring the constant auditory assault of the mansion or police station, you open a door and are greeted by that gentle, melancholic melody. The psychological relief is immediate and profound. The music tells you, without words, that you're safe. Your cortisol levels begin to drop. Your breathing slows. For a moment, the game releases its grip on your nervous system, but here's the insidious part. By creating these islands of safety, these moments of genuine relief, the game makes the return to danger that much more impactful. Every time you leave the save room, you're not just stepping back into a dangerous environment, you're voluntarily abandoning the one place where you felt secure. The save room theme becomes psychologically precious, a sonic talisman of safety that makes everything outside seem that much more hostile by contrast. The series also employs what sound designers call diegetic layering, where sounds exist both within the game world and in the player's perception simultaneously. The distant moans of zombies serve a dual purpose. Within the game's reality, they're simply the sounds of undead creatures. But to the player, they're warning signals, countdown timers indicating how long you have before the threat arrives. This dual function creates a unique form of anticipatory dread. You're not just hearing a zombie, you're hearing your window of safety closing second by second, groan by groan. The footsteps are another masterclass in psychological manipulation. In Resident Evil 2 and 3, the steady thud of Mr. X's or Nemesis's boots creates a persistent auditory stalker effect. You can hear them approaching through walls, through floors, from rooms you haven't even entered yet. This turns the entire environment into a threat detection system, with your ears constantly scanning for that distinctive rhythm. The psychological impact is profound. You can never fully relax because you're always listening, always monitoring, always anticipating. What makes this particularly effective is the way these persistent threats create what psychologists call hypervigilance. This is a state where your threat detection systems remain permanently activated, scanning for danger even when none is immediately present. In real-world trauma, hypervigilance is a symptom of PTSD. In Resident Evil, it's a deliberately induced gameplay state. The games train you to be constantly alert, to never trust silence, to always expect the next threat. This creates a level of sustained psychological tension that few other media can match. The ambient environmental sounds deserve special attention as well. The creak of the Spencer mansion, the drip of water in the Raccoon City sewers, the hum of machinery in the underground labs. These sounds create what's called sonic texture, a bed of audio that feels realistic and grounds you in the space. But Resident Evil uses this texture maliciously. By making the environment itself sound vaguely threatening, vaguely organic, vaguely alive, it ensures that even empty rooms feel dangerous. You're never quite sure if that creak was just the building settling or something moving behind the walls. The use of stereo and surround sound further amplifies the psychological impact. When a sound pans from your left ear to your right, your brain automatically tracks the movement, trying to predict trajectory and estimate threat level. Resident Evil uses this constantly, with enemies that circle you, with sounds that pass overhead, with noises that seem to surround you from all directions. This creates a feeling of being hunted, of being tracked by something intelligent and predatory. It's not enough to watch your screen. You have to listen with complete focus, turning your entire sensory apparatus into a threat detection grid. The breathing sounds of your character add yet another layer of psychological realism and stress. When you sprint, you hear laboured breathing. When you're in caution or danger status health-wise, the breathing becomes ragged, desperate. This creates a biofeedback loop. Your character's distress triggers sympathetic distress in you as a player. Your own breathing might unconsciously synchronize with the sounds coming from your speakers. This blurs the line between player and character, making the horror feel more personal, more immediate. Perhaps most insidiously, Resident Evil uses silence as a weapon of misdirection. Just because you can't hear anything doesn't mean you're safe. The games frequently place enemies in positions where they make no sound until you're dangerously close. A zombie standing perfectly still in a dark corner, a hunter crouched motionless behind furniture, a licker hanging from a ceiling you didn't think to look at. By teaching you to rely on audio cues, then occasionally removing those cues, the series ensures you can never develop a reliable threat detection pattern. The rules keep changing, keeping you perpetually uncertain. The vocal performances, particularly in the original Resident Evil and Code Veronica, contributed to the unsettling atmosphere in unexpected ways. The slightly stilted, awkward dialogue delivery created an uncanny valley effect. These characters sound almost right, almost natural, but something's slightly off. This subtle wrongness permeates the experience, contributing to a feeling that you're in a world that's fundamentally broken, fundamentally wrong. Even the humans don't sound quite human, which makes everything feel more alien and threatening. Resident Evil's level design is a masterclass in using space itself as a psychological weapon. The environments aren't just backdrops for horror. They're active participants in creating sustained dread, carefully architected to trigger specific anxiety responses and keep players in a constant state of disorientation and vulnerability. The Spencer Mansion from the original game remains one of the most psychologically effective environments in gaming history. Its design appears straightforward at first, a sprawling Gothic manor with interconnected rooms and hallways, but the psychological reality is far more complex. The mansion is deliberately designed to confuse spatial reasoning, to make navigation feel uncertain even after multiple playthroughs. Hallways that should connect don't. Rooms that feel like they should be adjacent are separated by bizarre architectural detours. The building itself seems to defy logical construction, creating a subtle cognitive dissonance that keeps players perpetually uncertain of their position. This disorientation is a calculated psychological attack. Humans rely heavily on spatial memory and mental mapping to feel secure in our environment. When we know where we are and how to navigate our surroundings, we feel a measure of control. Resident Evil systematically denies you this security. The mansion's layout resists easy memorization. Similar-looking hallways create false pattern recognition, leading you to think you know where you're going, only to find yourself somewhere unexpected. This forces you to pay constant attention to your environment, draining cognitive resources that could otherwise be used to manage fear. The camera angles intensify this spatial anxiety. The fixed cameras of the early games weren't just a technological limitation. They were a deliberate design choice that creates blind spots and forces uncomfortable perspectives. You often can't see what's ahead of you. You can't quickly scan a room before entering. Every door you open, every corner you round, requires a leap of faith into unknown space. This taps into a primal fear of the unseen, the terror of stepping into darkness without knowing what awaits. These camera angles also create what we might call directional vulnerability. When the camera is positioned behind you or to the side, you're acutely aware of space you can't monitor. Something could be approaching from behind, from the edge of the frame, from just out of sight. This creates a persistent feeling of exposure, of being watched, from angles you can't defend. It's psychologically exhausting to maintain this level of spatial paranoia, but the game demands it constantly. The narrow corridors deserve special attention. Claustrophobia is a powerful psychological trigger, even for people who don't consider themselves claustrophobic. When space constricts, we feel trapped, limited in our options for escape or evasion. Resident Evil uses narrow hallways relentlessly, creating situations where you can't easily dodge enemies, where retreat is as dangerous as advance. The walls press in, limiting your tactical options and amplifying the sense that you're boxed in with the threats. But the series also understands that constant claustrophobia becomes predictable, so it occasionally opens into larger spaces, grand hallways, entrance foyers, ballrooms. These moments of spatial relief are psychologically necessary to prevent adaptation, to keep the tight corridors feeling oppressive. But here's the trick. The large rooms aren't actually safer, they're just differently dangerous. Wide open spaces mean enemies can approach from multiple angles. They mean you have more ground to cover, more space to monitor. The relief you feel at escaping a narrow corridor quickly transforms into a different form of anxiety, keeping you off balance. The lighting in Resident Evil environments is perhaps the most sophisticated element of the architectural psychology. The games use darkness not as a simple obstacle, but as a tool to manipulate perception and attention. Pools of shadow aren't just areas you can't see. They're potential threat zones that demand constant monitoring. Every patch of darkness could hide an enemy, forcing you to approach cautiously, to waste time and mental energy evaluating threats that might not even exist. The flickering lights are particularly effective. Inconsistent illumination creates perceptual uncertainty. A room that's safe one moment becomes threatening the next when the lights flicker or fail. This unpredictability prevents you from ever feeling secure, even in areas you've cleared. The possibility that the environment itself could change, that danger could emerge from previously safe spaces, keeps your threat detection systems active at all times. Strategic use of backlighting creates silhouette effects that trigger instant threat recognition. Seeing the outline of a zombie or monster before you can make out details activates threat response before your conscious mind can process what you're seeing. This bypasses rational thought, hitting directly at the amygdala's pattern recognition for dangerous shapes. By the time your cortex catches up and identifies the specific threat, your body is already flooded with stress hormones. The use of color temperature and saturation adds another psychological layer. The early games favor sickly greens, bruised purples, diseased yellows. These color palettes create subtle physiological discomfort. Research suggests that certain color combinations and temperatures can induce mild nausea or unease, even when viewers can't articulate why. Resident Evil's environments often sit in this uncanny visual territory where nothing looks quite healthy, quite right, quite safe. The architectural repetition creates a psychological trap of its own. Hallways that look identical, rooms with similar layouts, these create false pattern recognition. You think you know where you are, you think you've been here before, but small differences gradually become apparent. This undermines your confidence in your own perception and memory. If you can't trust your recognition of the environment, what can you trust? This subtle erosion of certainty is psychologically destabilizing. The save rooms represent a brilliant architectural psychology. They're visually distinct from other spaces, often featuring warmer lighting, different color palettes, and more domestic or organized arrangements. This visual differentiation creates instant recognition and relief. But the architectural psychology goes deeper. Save rooms are almost always small, enclosed spaces with limited entry points. This satisfies a primal need for defensible positions, spaces where threats can only approach from predictable directions. The sense of security isn't just about game mechanics, it's about spatial psychology. The puzzle rooms add a different dimension to the architectural anxiety. These spaces require you to stop moving, to stand still and think, to focus your attention on environmental details rather than threats. This forced vulnerability creates intense psychological pressure. You're exposed, stationary, cognitively occupied, with solving a puzzle while simultaneously trying to maintain threat awareness. The architectural design of these rooms often reinforces the anxiety by providing multiple entry points, long sight lines where enemies could appear, or acoustic properties that make it hard to hear approaching threats. The Raccoon City Police Station in Resident Evil 2 represents perhaps the ultimate expression of architectural anxiety. It's a public building that should feel familiar and safe, a place associated with protection and order. But the architecture has been perverted, transformed into a labyrinth of danger. This cognitive dissonance between what the building should represent and what it actually contains creates deep psychological unease. The violation of a safe space, the corruption of an environment that should protect you, taps into fundamental fears about societal collapse and the failure of institutions meant to keep us secure. The station's architecture also plays with verticality in psychologically sophisticated ways. Threats can come from above or below, from the floors you've already cleared or the ones you haven't reached yet. This three-dimensional threat space is cognitively demanding to manage. Humans are reasonably good at monitoring horizontal space, but much less effective at maintaining awareness of vertical threats. The station exploits this, with enemies in the ceiling, dropping from windows, emerging from vents and maintenance shafts. The backtracking required by Resident Evil's design amplifies the architectural anxiety. Spaces that were safe become dangerous. Cleared rooms suddenly contain new threats. This means you can never mentally categorize a space as completed or safe. Every environment remains potentially dangerous, requiring sustained vigilance even in areas you've thoroughly explored. This prevents the psychological relief that comes from progression, from feeling like you're moving forward and leaving danger behind. In Resident Evil, danger follows you, surrounds you, and awaits you in places you thought you'd conquered. The outdoor spaces, when they appear, don't provide relief but rather a different form of anxiety. The courtyard in the Spencer Mansion, the streets of Raccoon City, these open areas create exposure, anxiety. You're visible from multiple angles, vulnerable to threats you can't easily hide from or predict. The sky above feels oppressive rather than liberating. It's too open, too uncontrolled, too full of vectors for attack. The architectural anxiety simply shifts rather than dissipates. The underground sections deserve special mention. Sewers, labs, tunnels, these subterranean spaces trigger claustrophobic and burial anxieties simultaneously. You're not just enclosed, you're enclosed underground, beneath the weight of earth and structure, with limited exits and no possibility of escape upward. The psychological pressure of these spaces is immense, playing on primal fears of entrapment and suffocation. The architecture itself becomes a threat, capable of collapse, of sealing you in darkness forever. The way doors function in Resident Evil adds a subtle but powerful architectural psychology. Every door is a transition point, a moment of vulnerability where you're locked into an animation and unable to respond to threats. The loading screen that accompanies door opening in classic titles transforms these transitions into moments of forced helplessness. You're neither in the space you're leaving nor the space you're entering, suspended in a liminal state where you're maximally vulnerable. This trains you to fear transitions, to hesitate before every door, to treat every threshold as a potential trap. The architectural design also uses what we might call negative reinforcement patterns. You learn through painful experience that certain types of spaces are dangerous. Long hallways mean limited maneuverability. Large rooms mean multiple threats. Tight corridors mean difficult aiming. These learned associations mean you begin dreading spaces before you even encounter threats in them. The architecture itself becomes a source of anxiety, independent of what it actually contains. The possibility of danger is as psychologically effective as the presence of danger. The level design's use of locked doors and required items creates an architectural feeling of being trapped in a puzzle box. You can see exits, see potential escapes, but you can't access them without specific keys or items. This creates a psychological pressure cooker effect. Escape is possible. You can see the way out, but you can't reach it. This is more psychologically frustrating than simply being trapped with no visible exit. The tantalizingly close but inaccessible escape route amplifies feelings of helplessness and desperation. Perhaps no aspect of Resident Evil's psychological toolkit is more effective than its brutal resource management. By creating artificial scarcity and forcing agonizing decisions about allocation, the series cultivates a persistent anxiety that permeates every moment of gameplay. This isn't just about making the game difficult, it's about inducing a specific psychological state where players feel perpetually under-equipped, vulnerable, and one mistake away from disaster. The limited inventory system is the foundation of this scarcity psychology. You can only carry a fixed number of items, forcing constant decisions about what to keep and what to leave behind. This creates what psychologists call decision fatigue, a state where the cognitive load of constant choice-making depletes mental resources and increases stress. Should you carry more ammunition or healing items? Should you take the puzzle item now or come back for it? Should you keep the weapon you might need later or make? room for resources you need now. Each of these decisions carries weight because the game ensures that wrong choices have consequences. Run out of ammunition at a critical moment, and you might be forced into a punishing retreat. Lack healing items when you need them, and you risk death and loss of progress. The inventory system transforms every item pickup into a miniature crisis of resource allocation, a constant stream of micro-decisions that steadily erodes your cognitive stamina. The scarcity of ammunition is particularly psychologically effective. Every bullet feels precious. Every shot fired is a gamble that the immediate threat justifies the long-term cost. This transforms combat from an empowering power fantasy into a source of anxiety and dread. You're not a powerful warrior mowing down enemies. You're a desperate survivor trying to conserve resources while staying alive. This shift in psychological framing is crucial to the sustained terror. The scarcity of ammunition is particularly psychologically effective. Every bullet feels precious. Every shot fired is a gamble that the immediate threat justifies the long-term cost. This transforms combat from an empowering power fantasy into a source of anxiety and dread. You're not a powerful warrior mowing down enemies. You're a desperate survivor trying to conserve resources while staying alive. This shift in psychological framing is crucial to the sustained terror. The game trains you to second-guess every engagement. Can I avoid this enemy instead of fighting it? If I fight, what's the minimum ammunition I can use and still survive? Is it worth using a grenade, or should I save it for a harder encounter? These calculations run constantly in the background of your mind, creating a persistent cognitive load that compounds the environmental and auditory stress. You're not just afraid of the monsters, you're afraid of your own resource expenditure, of the slow mathematical march toward helplessness. The healing item scarcity operates on similar psychological principles, but adds an additional layer of body horror and vulnerability. When your health is low, you're not just statistically weaker, you're visually and audibly reminded of your damaged state. Your character limps, breathes heavily, moves slower. This creates a feedback loop where your avatar's vulnerability makes you feel personally vulnerable. The scarcity of herbs and first aid sprays means you often can't immediately address this vulnerability, forcing you to continue playing while feeling damaged, exposed, fragile. This creates what we might call deferred relief anxiety. You know healing is possible. You might even have healing items in storage, but the cost of backtracking to a safe room, the risk of using your current healing items when you might need them more desperately later, creates a psychological pressure to continue in a damaged state. You're constantly negotiating with yourself about when the right time to heal is, adding another layer of decision-making stress to an already overwhelming cognitive load. The save ribbon system in the original games represented perhaps the most psychologically brutal form of scarcity. You couldn't save whenever you wanted. You needed to find or conserve ink ribbons, and each save consumed one. This transformed the act of saving, normally a moment of relief and security in games, into another resource management crisis. Do I save now, or push forward and hope I can reach the next ribbon? If I die without saving, how much progress do I lose? This meta-level anxiety about preservation of progress added yet another dimension to the sustained dread. The strategic placement of item boxes and storage creates a fascinating psychological dynamic. You know powerful weapons and ample supplies exist in the game world, but they're locked away in storage, inaccessible until you backtrack to a safe room. This creates a paradoxical situation where you're simultaneously resourceful and resource-starved. You have what you need, but you can't access it when you need it. This geography of scarcity means you're often fighting with suboptimal loadouts, making do with less than ideal equipment because the cost of optimization is too high. The broken weapon mechanics, particularly the defensive items in Resident Evil Remake and the breakable knives in later games, add another layer to the scarcity psychology. Even the tools you rely on can fail you, can be depleted or destroyed. This removes any sense of permanent security. There's no safe build, no loadout that makes you invulnerable. Everything is temporary, everything degrades, everything can be lost. This impermanence creates a baseline anxiety that never fully dissipates. The way the games telegraph future resource needs without explicitly stating them is psychologically sophisticated. You find a locked door that clearly requires a special weapon or tool. You encounter an enemy type that your current equipment barely scratches. These hints that you're under-equipped for what's coming create anticipatory anxiety about future scarcity. You're not just worried about your current resources, you're worried about whether you'll have what you need for challenges that haven't even appeared yet. The economic system in Resident Evil 4, while different from classic inventory management, creates its own scarcity psychology. The peseta currency system forces you to make purchasing decisions with incomplete information. Do you upgrade your current weapons or save for better ones? Do you buy supplies now or risk waiting for cheaper options later? The merchant's limited inventory and the one-way nature of upgrade paths mean every financial decision has lasting consequences. You're building a loadout through cumulative choices, and wrong choices early can leave you struggling later. The attaché case Tetris puzzle of Resident Evil 4 deserves special attention. By making inventory management a spatial puzzle, the game transforms resource scarcity into a visual and tactile challenge. You can see all your items, see the space they consume, see the gaps and inefficiencies. This visual representation of scarcity makes the limitation feel more concrete, more oppressive. You're literally running out of space, and the game forces you to confront that reality every time you pick up something new. The strategic resource placement throughout levels creates behavioral conditioning. The games teach you that supplies appear at predictable intervals, just frequent enough to keep you going, but never abundant enough to make you feel secure. This creates a psychological dependence on this resource drip feed. You begin mentally mapping supply locations, planning routes that maximize resource collection, altering your behavior to adapt to the scarcity rather than fighting against it. You become complicit in your own resource anxiety, internalizing the scarcity mindset the game imposes. The way consumable resources interrupt progression creates additional psychological pressure. You can't just push forward continuously. You need to stop, search, backtrack for replies. This breaks the flow of progression, creating frustration that compounds the fear. You want to advance, to escape, to complete objectives, but you're forced to slow down, to scavenge, to engage with the resource management systems. This frustration doesn't replace the fear, it layers on top of it, creating a complex emotional stew of dread, frustration, and anxiety. The defensive item system, particularly in the remake, creates interesting scarcity psychology around preventative resources. You can carry items that save you from grabs and attacks, but using them consumes them permanently. This creates a psychological split between proactive resource use, spending ammunition to kill enemies, and reactive resource use, spending defensive items when attacked. Both types of expenditure feel wasteful in different ways, creating no-win scenarios where any resource use feels like a mistake. The first aid spray versus herb combination system creates a risk-reward calculation around healing efficiency. First aid sprays provide complete healing instantly, but are rare and precious. Herb combinations require planning and inventory space but can be more efficient. This forces you to mathematically optimize your healing, to calculate hit points and resource costs, to treat your own survival as an economic problem. This cognitive reframing of health as a resource to be managed rather than a state to be maintained creates psychological distance from your character, while simultaneously making you hyper-aware of their vulnerability. The game's difficulty in replacing lost resources creates a psychological phenomenon we might call death spiral anxiety. If you make mistakes and burn through resources, you enter a weakened state where success becomes progressively harder, which leads to more mistakes and more resource consumption. The possibility of entering an unwinnable state, of depleting resources to the point where progression becomes nearly impossible, creates a meta-level dread. You're not just afraid of the immediate threats, you're afraid of past mistakes compounding into future impossibility. The limited saving creates a unique relationship with risk-taking. In games with unlimited saves, risky strategies are psychologically easier because failure only costs minutes of progress. In classic Resident Evil, risky strategies could cost hours if they fail. This fundamentally changes your psychological approach to problem solving. You become conservative, risk-averse, choosing safe but inefficient strategies over dangerous but potentially resource-conserving approaches. This risk aversion becomes another form of psychological pressure, forcing you to play in ways that feel restrictive and stifling. The scarcity creates what economists call loss aversion, where the fear of losing resources outweighs the potential benefit of using them. You hoard ammunition, healing items, even save ribbons, afraid to use them because you might need them more desperately later. This often leads to finishing the game with substantial unused resources, but the scarcity anxiety prevented you from ever feeling comfortable deploying them. The fear of future scarcity is more powerful than the reality of current abundance. The introduction of persistent stalker enemies like Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 and Mr. X in the Resident Evil 2 remake represents an evolution in psychological horror design. These aren't just tough enemies, they're neurological weapons, specifically engineered to trigger and maintain fear. Responses that traditional horror game enemies cannot achieve. Understanding the brain science behind why these encounters are so devastating reveals just how sophisticated Resident Evil's approach to terror has become. The human brain's threat detection system evolved over millions of years to identify and respond to predators. Our ancestors, who were better at recognizing, avoiding, and escaping from threats, lived longer and reproduced more successfully. This evolutionary pressure created neural architecture specifically designed to detect, track, and respond to persistent threats. Nemesis and Mr. X hack directly into this ancient circuitry, triggering responses that bypass rational thought and hit directly at our most primal survival instincts. The key psychological mechanism at work here is what neuroscientists call unpredictable threat monitoring. When you know exactly when and where danger will appear, your stress response activates, peaks, and then resolves. But when a threat could appear at any moment from any direction, your nervous system maintains a state of elevated readiness indefinitely. This is exhausting both psychologically and physiologically. Your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline not just during encounters, but during the entire period when an encounter might occur. Nemesis's ability to appear in theoretically cleared areas creates what psychologists call learned helplessness. In classic conditioning experiments, animals exposed to inescapable stress eventually stop trying to avoid it, even when escape becomes possible. They learn that their actions don't reliably produce safety. Resident Evil 3 creates a milder version of this through Nemesis. You can't permanently eliminate the threat. You can't create reliably safe spaces outside designated safe rooms. Your ability to control your environment and establish security is fundamentally undermined. This erosion of player agency is psychologically devastating. Games typically empower players, giving them increasing control and capability as they progress. But Nemesis represents a persistent negation of that power. No matter how skilled you become, no matter how well equipped, this threat remains. It doesn't care about your progression, your mastery, your carefully hoarded resources. It simply pursues relentlessly, transforming your power fantasy into a desperate flight response. The footsteps of Mr. X in the Resident Evil 2 remake demonstrate brilliant audio-driven threat psychology. You can hear him through walls and floors, tracking his movement through the police station even when you can't see him. This creates a three-dimensional threat awareness requirement that's cognitively exhausting. You're not just playing the game in front of you. You're maintaining a mental map of Mr. X's position, predicting his patrol patterns, calculating whether you have time to solve a puzzle or grab an item before he reaches your location. This constant spatial tracking activates the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for spatial memory and navigation, forcing it to work in overdrive. Simultaneously, your amygdala maintains elevated threat response, and your prefrontal cortex tries to make rational decisions about resource management and puzzle solving. This multi-system activation creates intense cognitive load. You're using more of your brain simultaneously than normal gameplay requires, and the sustained activation leads to mental fatigue that makes the fear feel more overwhelming. The unpredictability of stalker appearances triggers what's known as anticipatory anxiety. Research on stress responses shows that uncertain threats produce higher anxiety than certain ones. If you knew exactly when and where Nemesis would appear, you could mentally prepare, spike your stress response at the appropriate moment, and then relax afterward. But the uncertainty means you can never fully relax. Every door could reveal a stalker. Every corner could hide an ambush. This maintains your stress hormones at elevated levels indefinitely. The design choice to make stalkers incredibly difficult to kill, or only temporarily neutralized, is psychologically crucial. When you finally land enough shots to drop Nemesis, there's a moment of triumph, a surge of relief. But the game immediately undermines that relief by revealing the defeat is temporary. This creates a psychological pattern of hope, followed by disappointment, of earned relief that's then snatched away. This emotional whiplash is psychologically punishing, teaching you that safety is always illusory, that victory is always temporary. The stalker enemies also create what we might call attention fragmentation. Normally in Resident Evil, you can focus entirely on immediate threats. You clear a room, the threat is neutralized. You can focus on exploration and puzzle solving. But with a stalker active, you must split your attention constantly. Part of your awareness remains dedicated to monitoring for the stalker, even while you're engaged with other tasks. This divided attention makes everything harder and more stressful. You can't fully commit to any single task because part of your cognitive resources must always remain on stalker watch. The way stalkers interrupt puzzle solving creates a unique form of psychological pressure. Puzzles require calm, focused thought. You need to read clues, manipulate items, think through solutions. But trying to engage in this cognitive work while a stalker hunts you is nearly impossible. The fear response and the analytical thinking required for puzzles activate competing neural systems. Trying to do both simultaneously is like trying to run a marathon while doing calculus. The resulting cognitive interference makes simple puzzles feel overwhelmingly difficult. The stalker chase sequences trigger the brain's fight or flight response at maximum intensity. When Nemesis bursts through a wall, or Mr. X's footsteps suddenly accelerate behind you, your sympathetic nervous system dumps a massive dose of adrenaline into your bloodstream. Your heart rate spikes, your pupils dilate. Time seems to slow down as your brain accelerates its processing speed. This is your body's emergency overdrive mode, designed for life or death situations. Activating this system for entertainment is neurologically intense in ways that gentler horror simply can't match. But here's where the sustained terror comes in. The fight or flight response is designed for brief, intense situations. Chase the prey or flee the predator, and then the encounter resolves one way or another. But in Resident Evil, these encounters can repeat multiple times across hours of gameplay. Your nervous system gets repeatedly hammered with maximum intensity stress responses, and between encounters, you remain in elevated readiness. This creates a form of acute stress that can leave genuine physiological impacts. Players report shaking hands, rapid heartbeat, and sweating. These aren't just emotional reactions, they're genuine stress responses. The stalker encounters also exploit what psychologists call variable ratio reinforcement. Sometimes fleeing works, sometimes hiding works, sometimes fighting back works. But none of these strategies work reliably every time. This unpredictability in what constitutes effective response creates a psychological pattern similar to gambling addiction. You keep trying different strategies, hoping to find the one that provides consistent safety, but the game ensures no such strategy exists. This keeps you engaged, but perpetually frustrated and anxious. The recovery periods between stalker encounters don't provide genuine psychological relief. Even when Nemesis isn't currently present, the knowledge that he could appear at any moment maintains your stress response. This is similar to the psychological impact of living in a dangerous neighborhood. Even during peaceful moments, the knowledge that violence could erupt prevents true relaxation. Your nervous system can't fully stand down because the threat is ongoing and unpredictable, just temporarily not visible. The way stalkers create no-win scenarios is psychologically brutal. You're in a narrow hallway. Mr. X approaches from one end. Zombies block the other. Your ammunition is limited. Any choice involves cost and risk. Do you try to slip past Mr. X and take damage? Do you use precious ammunition on zombies to create an escape route? Do you stand and fight Mr. X knowing you can only slow him down? These forced choices between bad options create what psychologists call approach avoidance conflict, where every possible action has significant negative consequences. This type of decision-making is among the most stressful cognitive experiences. The stalker enemies also create an interesting form of parasocial relationship. Through repeated encounters, players develop genuine emotional responses to these entities. Nemesis becomes a personal nemesis, not just a game mechanic. Mr. X becomes a hated pursuer whose very footsteps trigger immediate anxiety. This personalization of the threat makes it more psychologically impactful. You're not just avoiding a game obstacle, you're fleeing from an entity you've come to fear and hate on a personal level. The sound design around stalkers deserves special attention. Nemesis's guttural roar, his unique footsteps, the crash when he smashes through obstacles, all create audio signatures that trigger immediate fear responses. After a few encounters, hearing these sounds produces the same physiological response as seeing the stalker himself. This is classical conditioning in action. The neutral stimulus, specific sound, becomes associated with the unconditioned stimulus, the threat, producing the conditioned response, fear, even in the absence of the actual threat. The stalker encounters create lasting psychological impacts that extend beyond the immediate gameplay. Players report hearing phantom footsteps, feeling anxious when entering new rooms even in safe areas, and experiencing elevated stress that takes time to dissipate even after turning off the game. This persistence of fear response indicates genuine neurological conditioning. The game has successfully trained your nervous system to maintain threat vigilance, and that training doesn't immediately reverse when the console powers off. The way stalkers force resource expenditure creates compounding psychological pressure. Every encounter costs ammunition, healing items, time, and progress. You're not just afraid of the stalker itself, you're afraid of the cumulative cost of repeated encounters. Each time you hear those footsteps, you're not just thinking about the immediate danger. You're calculating the resource cost, the lost time, the potential for mistakes that could cascade into larger problems. This multi-layered anxiety compounds the fear far beyond the simple threat of damage or death. The stalker mechanics also create interesting speedrun psychology. Expert players learn to manipulate stalker AI, to predict patterns, to exploit positioning. But this mastery requires sustained exposure to the very encounters that most frighten casual players. This creates a fascinating psychological arc where initial terror transforms into analytical problem-solving through repeated exposure. The fear doesn't disappear, but it becomes manageable through understanding and practice. This mirrors real-world exposure therapy for phobias. Beyond the immediate mechanics of fear generation, Resident Evil excels at creating cognitive distortions that persist throughout the play experience and even linger afterward. These aren't bugs or accidents. They're carefully engineered perceptual manipulations that change how players process information, assess risk, and experience reality both within the game and in subtle ways outside it. The series creates what we might call threat inflation, where your perception of danger systematically exceeds the actual threat level. Every shadow might hide an enemy. Every sound could signal an approaching threat. Every item pickup might trigger an ambush. The games train you to expect danger constantly, and this expectation colors every experience with anxiety. The actual frequency of threats is carefully calibrated to reinforce this perception without undermining it through excessive exposure. This creates a fascinating psychological phenomenon where players become their own worst enemies. Your imagination, primed by the game's atmosphere and reinforced by intermittent actual threats, generates more fear than the game explicitly provides. You scare yourself with possibilities, with anticipated dangers that never materialize. This is exponentially more psychologically powerful than simply presenting constant actual threats, because your imagination is infinitely more creative and personally targeted than any game designer could be. The fixed camera angles and limited fields of view in classic Resident Evil games create perceptual blind spots that your brain fills in with assumed threats. When you can't see what's around a corner or behind you, your mind populates those spaces with potential dangers. Neuroscience research shows that the brain hates uncertainty and will create narratives to fill informational gaps. Resident Evil weaponizes this tendency, creating systematic uncertainty that your brain resolves by assuming danger. This makes you perceive threat even in empty space. The games also manipulate time perception in sophisticated ways. During intense encounters, players often report that time seems to slow down or speed up. This isn't just subjective impression. Fear genuinely alters temporal processing in the brain. The amygdala's activation during threat response causes the hippocampus to create richer, more detailed memories, which creates the subjective impression that events lasted longer than they actually did. Resident Evil's most intense moments feel stretched, extended, allowing the fear to sink deeper into memory. The resource scarcity creates cognitive distortions around value and need. A single green herb becomes psychologically precious. Finding a box of shotgun shells feels like discovering treasure. This inflation of perceived value extends beyond rational assessment. Players know intellectually that these are just game items, but the scarcity conditioning creates genuine emotional responses to finding or losing resources. This emotional investment makes the survival mechanics feel more impactful, and the potential loss of resources more anxiety-inducing. The game's puzzle design creates interesting cognitive distortions around problem-solving capability. Under normal circumstances, most Resident Evil puzzles aren't particularly complex, but solved under stress, while monitoring for threats, while managing scarce resources, these simple puzzles become cognitively demanding challenges. The game makes you feel less intelligent than you are by overwhelming your cognitive processing capacity. This perception of reduced competence feeds back into the vulnerability and helplessness the game cultivates. The way death is handled creates perceptual distortions around consequence. The "you died" screen and loss of progress since your last save creates a disproportionate sense of failure and setback. Players often feel more lost than the actual time investment represents, because the emotional intensity of the experience magnifies its perceived duration and importance. Losing 20 minutes of progress can feel like losing hours because those 20 minutes were so psychologically intense. The inventory management creates cognitive distortions around preparation and readiness. Players consistently feel underprepared regardless of their actual loadout. You could have ample ammunition and healing items, but the scarcity mindset the game instills makes you feel vulnerable anyway. This perception gap between actual capability and perceived capability keeps anxiety high, even when objective circumstances don't justify it. You've internalized the game's scarcity logic to the point where abundance still feels like deprivation. The save room safety creates a cognitive distortion we might call threshold anxiety. The moment you leave a save room, even before encountering any actual threat, your stress level spikes. You're transitioning from absolute safety to potential danger, and your brain begins the threat anticipation process immediately. The door itself becomes a psychological barrier between states, and crossing it requires conscious effort and produces measurable stress response. This makes save rooms feel not just safer, but safe in a way that highlights the danger of everything outside them. The enemy design creates perceptual distortions around biological normalcy. After extended play sessions, players report that the zombies, the mutated creatures, the body horror elements begin to feel less shocking, almost normalized. This is a defense mechanism called habituation, where repeated exposure reduces emotional response. But here's the insidious part. This habituation makes you vulnerable to new horrors. Just when you've adjusted to zombies, the game introduces lickers or hunters or other creatures that reshock your system. The perceptual baseline keeps shifting, preventing full adaptation. The game creates temporal distortions around pacing and progression. Hours can pass without players realizing how long they've been playing, because the constant tension maintains high engagement. Alternatively, relatively brief play sessions can feel exhausting, because the psychological intensity drains mental resources rapidly. This disconnection between clock time and experiential time makes it difficult to accurately gauge how much time you're investing in the game, which can lead to longer sessions than intended and greater cumulative psychological impact. The lighting and shadow design creates perceptual uncertainty that your visual cortex struggles to resolve. Is that shadow an object or an enemy? Is that shape a corpse or a sleeping zombie? The game deliberately creates visual ambiguity that forces your brain to work harder to identify threats, and in conditions of uncertainty, the brain defaults to assuming danger. This means you're constantly processing visual information as potentially threatening, maintaining visual vigilance that's cognitively taxing over extended periods. The audio mixing creates perceptual distortions around distance and direction. Sounds seem closer than they are, or seem to come from directions they don't actually originate from. This auditory misdirection keeps your threat localization systems confused and uncertain. You can't reliably use sound to map threat positions, which removes a crucial tool for managing fear and forces greater reliance on potentially unreliable visual information. This multisensory uncertainty compounds perceptual stress. The game's use of false scares creates conditioning that makes you jumpy and reactive. A window breaks, but nothing comes through. Crows startle you, but don't attack. These non-threatening surprises train your startle response to activate at lower thresholds. Over time, you become physiologically more reactive, jumping at smaller provocations. This heightened startle response makes genuine threats more impactful and makes the entire experience more physiologically exhausting. To truly understand why Resident Evil's approach to horror is so psychologically effective, we need to examine what's happening at the biological level. The sustained terror the series creates isn't just mental or emotional, it's fundamentally physiological, triggering cascades of neurochemical reactions that alter your physical state in measurable ways. When you encounter a zombie or hear Nemesis's footsteps, your hypothalamus triggers your sympathetic nervous system, initiating what's commonly called the fight or flight response. Your adrenal glands dump epinephrine, adrenaline, and norepinephrine into your bloodstream. Your heart rate increases, pumping more blood to muscles. Your pupils dilate to take in more visual information. Your liver releases glucose for quick energy. Your breathing accelerates to oxygenate blood more rapidly. These are the same physical responses your ancestors experienced when facing actual predators. But here's what makes Resident Evil's sustained terror biologically unique. These stress responses are designed for brief, intense situations. Chase or be chased for a few minutes, and then the encounter resolves. Your parasympathetic nervous system activates, bringing you back to baseline. But Resident Evil keeps you in this activated state for hours. The threats are persistent enough that your sympathetic nervous system can't fully stand down, but not so constant that you experience complete exhaustion. The game finds a sweet spot of sustained physiological stress. The prolonged activation of stress systems triggers the release of cortisol from your adrenal cortex. Cortisol is sometimes called the stress hormone, though that's an oversimplification. In short bursts, cortisol helps mobilize energy and enhance memory formation. But sustained elevation can have broader effects. It can disrupt sleep patterns, increase anxiety sensitivity, and create a general sense of unease that persists beyond the immediate stressor. This is why extended Resident Evil play sessions can leave you feeling genuinely stressed and on edge hours after you stop playing. The game's jump scares and sudden threats trigger what's called the acoustic startle reflex, a primitive response mediated by the brainstem that occurs before conscious processing. A sudden loud sound or visual shock causes automatic muscle contractions, particularly in the neck and facial muscles. This reflex is hardwired and nearly impossible to suppress consciously. Resident Evil uses this strategically, knowing that no amount of mental preparation can prevent the physiological startle response from activating. But the sustained terror goes beyond simple startle responses. The constant low-level threat maintains your locus coeruleus, a small structure in the brainstem, in an activated state. This structure produces norepinephrine and plays a crucial role in the stress response and attention. When activated, it increases alertness and vigilance. Chronic activation can lead to feelings of anxiety and hypervigilance that extend beyond the specific threat that initially triggered it. This is part of why Resident Evil's fear feels so persistent and pervasive. The game's horror also activates your amygdala intensely and repeatedly. The amygdala is central to fear learning and emotional memory formation. Each frightening encounter strengthens certain neural pathways, essentially training your brain to respond with fear to stimuli associated with the game. This is why specific sounds, visual elements, or even thinking about the game can trigger anxiety responses. You've formed strong associative memories that link certain stimuli with threat, and those associations persist in your neural architecture. The visual processing of body horror elements in Resident Evil activates disgust circuits in addition to fear circuits. The insula, a brain region involved in processing disgust and interoception, awareness of internal body states, shows heightened activity when viewing mutilated bodies or grotesque creatures. This disgust response has a strong visceral component, often producing mild nausea or physical discomfort. By combining fear and disgust, the games create a more comprehensive negative emotional response than fear alone would produce. The resource management and decision-making under stress activates your prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex involved in executive function and working memory. But stress hormones actually impair prefrontal cortex function. High levels of cortisol and norepinephrine shift cognitive processing from thoughtful analysis to rapid reactive responses. This is why you make worse decisions under stress in Resident Evil, why you panic and waste ammunition, or make navigation errors. Your brain is literally functioning differently under the neurochemical influence of sustained fear. The games create interesting effects on memory consolidation. The heightened emotional arousal during frightening moments causes the amygdala to enhance memory encoding in the hippocampus. This is why you remember specific terrifying moments from Resident Evil with crystal clarity, often more vividly than other gaming experiences. The emotional intensity literally burns these memories deeper into your brain. This enhanced memory formation means the experiences stay with you, potentially for life, creating lasting psychological impact. The physiological stress responses can create something researchers call stress inoculation with repeated exposure. Players who push through the fear and continue playing can develop greater stress tolerance, similar to how exposure therapy works for phobias. Their physiological responses to threats become less extreme over time as they learn the threats are not real and develop coping mechanisms. This is why veteran players can experience reduced fear compared to newcomers. Their stress biology has adapted through repeated exposure. However, there's a darker side to this biological impact. For some players, particularly those with pre-existing anxiety disorders or trauma histories, the sustained physiological stress can trigger genuine anxiety attacks or flashbacks. The game's ability to activate stress systems so effectively means it can occasionally activate them too well, producing responses that go beyond entertainment into genuine distress. This speaks to the power of the biological manipulation but also its potential risks. The sleep disruption many players experience after extended Resident Evil sessions has biological roots. The sustained cortisol elevation and repeated adrenaline spikes can keep your sympathetic nervous system activated even after you stop playing. This makes it difficult to relax into the parasympathetic state necessary for sleep. Additionally, the vivid fear memories encoded during play can surface during sleep onset or in dreams, further disrupting sleep quality. The biological impact extends well beyond active gameplay. The games also trigger interesting effects in the endogenous opioid system. During particularly intense stress, the brain releases endorphins, natural painkillers that can produce mild euphoria. This is part of why some players find horror games addictive despite or perhaps because of the fear. This cycle of stress followed by relief and endorphin release creates a neurochemical reward pattern that can be psychologically compelling. You're literally getting a chemical high from the fear and its resolution. The sustained terror also affects your autonomic nervous system's baseline. With repeated play, some players develop lowered heart rate variability and elevated baseline heart rate that persists outside of gameplay. This indicates that the stress response has begun generalizing beyond the specific context of the game. Your nervous system is maintaining a higher state of readiness even when threats are not present, essentially remaining partially primed for stress responses. The biological responses to stalker enemies like Nemesis deserve special attention. The unpredictable threat creates what's called sustained anticipatory anxiety, which maintains cortisol at elevated levels for extended periods. Unlike brief stress responses that spike and resolve, this sustained elevation can have more significant physiological effects. Players report muscle tension, headaches, and digestive disturbances after extended stalker encounters, all physical manifestations of prolonged stress hormone activation. The way Resident Evil manipulates your breathing patterns has interesting biological implications. During tense moments, players often unconsciously hold their breath or breathe shallowly. This reduces oxygen delivery to the brain and can intensify feelings of anxiety and panic. The game's design encourages this maladaptive breathing pattern through sustained tension, creating a feedback loop where poor breathing increases anxiety, which further disrupts breathing. Some players consciously focus on breathing techniques to manage this physiological response. The biological impact of Resident Evil's sustained terror reveals why the series feels fundamentally different from other horror experiences. It's not just psychologically frightening, it's physiologically demanding, activating stress systems in ways that produce measurable bodily changes. This comprehensive biological engagement creates horror that feels visceral and real because, in biological terms, it is. Your body is responding as if the threats are genuine, and that physical reality anchors the psychological terror. Resident Evil's blueprint for sustained psychological terror has influenced the broader horror gaming landscape profoundly. Modern horror designers increasingly recognize that lasting fear comes not from momentary shocks, but from sustained atmospheric dread, resource tension, and the manipulation of player psychology over extended periods. Understanding how this approach is evolving reveals the future of horror as a medium. The most significant legacy of Resident Evil's design philosophy is the industry-wide movement away from jump-scare-dependent horror toward what we might call ambient dread systems. Games like Amnesia, Alien Isolation, and Outlast all draw from the Resident Evil playbook, creating persistent threats, resource scarcity, and oppressive atmospheres that maintain tension without relying on cheap shocks. These games understand that the anticipation of horror is more powerful than the horror itself, that the spaces between scares are where true fear grows. And Isolation represents perhaps the most sophisticated evolution of Resident Evil's stalker mechanics. The xenomorph AI creates genuinely unpredictable behavior patterns that resist player exploitation. unlike Nemesis or Mr. X, which follow programmed routines that expert players can learn and manipulate. The Alien uses dynamic behavior systems that adapt to player tactics. This creates stalker anxiety that doesn't diminish with mastery, a neurological arms race between player learning and AI adaptation that maintains fear even for experienced players. The modern indie horror scene has embraced Resident Evil's resource scarcity philosophy, but often pushes it to more extreme conclusions. Games that provide no combat options at all, only evasion and hiding, create even more profound helplessness than Resident Evil's limited ammunition approach. This design choice forces players into pure prey psychology, eliminating even the illusion of offensive capability. The psychological impact can be intense, though it risks creating frustration rather than fear if not carefully balanced. Virtual reality represents the next frontier for sustained terror design, and Resident Evil's principles translate powerfully to this medium. Resident Evil 7 and Village in VR demonstrate how the series' atmospheric design, resource tension, and stalker mechanics become overwhelmingly intense when experienced through immersive technology. The physiological responses are amplified because your sensory systems can't easily distinguish the virtual environment from reality. The sustained terror becomes almost unbearably visceral, but VR also reveals interesting limitations of sustained terror design. Many players can only tolerate shorter VR horror sessions before the physiological stress becomes too uncomfortable. This suggests there may be natural limits to how intense and sustained horror can become before it crosses from entertainment into genuine distress. Future horror design may need to carefully calibrate intensity and duration to remain within tolerable bounds while still delivering impactful experiences. The integration of biometric feedback into horror gaming represents a fascinating potential evolution. Imagine a Resident Evil-style game that monitors your heart rate, skin conductivity, and breathing patterns, then dynamically adjusts its horror elements based on your physiological state. When your stress levels drop, the game increases tension. When they peak too high, it provides momentary relief. This could create perfectly calibrated sustained terror that maintains optimal fear levels throughout the experience, never allowing adaptation but also preventing overwhelming distress. The neuroscience of horror is advancing rapidly, and game designers are increasingly incorporating research findings into their development processes. Understanding how different brain systems respond to various stimuli allows for more targeted psychological manipulation. Future horror games might feature enemy designs specifically engineered to trigger maximum amygdala response, soundscapes tuned to optimal frequencies for anxiety induction, and environmental layouts that exploit known perceptual biases and cognitive limitations. The psychological research on trauma and stress has raised interesting ethical questions about horror entertainment. When games like Resident Evil can produce genuine physiological stress responses, activate PTSD-like symptoms in susceptible individuals, and create lasting fear memories, at what point does entertainment cross into psychological harm? The industry is beginning to grapple with these questions, implementing more robust content warnings and considering the potential mental health impacts of increasingly intense horror experiences. The social dynamics of horror gaming are evolving in interesting ways. Streaming culture has transformed horror from primarily solitary experiences to shared social events. Watching others play Resident Evil, experiencing their fear vicariously, creates different psychological dynamics than playing yourself. The fear becomes mediated through the streamer's reactions, potentially less intense, but also more sustainable for extended viewing. This social dimension may represent a new direction for horror design, creating experiences optimized for both players and viewers. The educational applications of Resident Evil psychological techniques are being explored in unexpected contexts. Stress inoculation training, exposure therapy for anxiety disorders, and research into fear learning all draw insights from understanding how horror games manipulate psychology. The same mechanisms that make Resident Evil terrifying could potentially be harnessed therapeutically, helping individuals build stress tolerance or overcome specific phobias in controlled virtual environments. The preservation and continued relevance of classic Resident Evil titles speaks to the timeless effectiveness of their psychological design. Despite dated graphics and clunky controls, the original trilogy and Code Veronica still generate genuine fear in new players. This demonstrates that sustained terror doesn't depend on technological sophistication, but on psychological sophistication. The fundamental design principles, the manipulation of sound, space, and scarcity, remain effective regardless of visual fidelity. The remake trend within the Resident Evil franchise itself reveals interesting insights about how psychological horror can be updated for modern audiences while retaining its core effectiveness. The Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes preserve the essential psychological architecture of the originals while updating presentation and refining mechanics. This suggests that the foundational principles of sustained terror are not time-bound or technology-dependent, but represent something more fundamental about human psychology. The future of horror gaming will likely see increased personalization based on individual player psychology. Machine learning systems could potentially analyze player behavior, identify specific fears and sensitivities, and dynamically adjust horror elements to maximize impact for that individual. Your personal Resident Evil experience could be subtly different from mine, each version optimized for our unique psychological profiles. This raises fascinating possibilities and equally fascinating ethical concerns. The integration of persistent world elements and ongoing narrative could extend Resident Evil's sustained terror model beyond individual play sessions. Imagine a horror experience where threats and story developments continue even when you're not actively playing, where the psychological pressure doesn't release when you turn off the console. This always-on horror could create unprecedented, sustained psychological engagement, but would require careful design to avoid becoming oppressive or intrusive. The mobile gaming platform presents interesting challenges and opportunities for sustained terror design. The shorter play sessions typical of mobile gaming seem antithetical to Resident Evil's approach, which relies on extended tension building. But mobile's constant connectivity and integration into daily life could enable new forms of persistent horror, where brief moments of fear are distributed throughout the day rather than concentrated in single sessions. This could create a different but potentially equally effective form of sustained psychological impact. The application of horror design principles to non-horror games is an emerging trend. The resource tension and oppressive atmosphere that make Resident Evil terrifying can create engaging challenge and immersion in other genres. Survival games, post-apocalyptic titles, and even some action games borrow these psychological techniques, demonstrating that the principles underlying sustained terror have broader applicability than pure horror experiences. The accessibility conversation within gaming is reaching horror titles, raising interesting questions about how to make psychologically intense experiences available to wider audiences without fundamentally compromising their impact. Can you create adjustable fear intensity that lets players customize their psychological stress levels? Can you provide options that reduce specific triggers without removing all tension? These design challenges are pushing the genre to think more carefully about who their audiences are and how different players experience and tolerate fear. The cultural differences in how various audiences respond to horror suggest that sustained terror design may need regional customization. What triggers fear effectively in Western audiences may not translate perfectly to Asian or other markets. Resident Evil's Japanese origins give it certain cultural perspectives on body horror and environmental dread that may resonate differently across cultures. Future horror design may increasingly account for these cultural variables, creating region-specific fear experiences. The preservation of horror gaming history faces unique challenges. Unlike other game genres, horror's effectiveness can diminish with technological obsolescence. The fixed camera angles that made early Resident Evil games claustrophobic can feel merely dated to modern players. How do we preserve and communicate the psychological impact of classic horror when the context that made it effective has changed? This archival challenge is important for understanding the evolution of psychological game design. The academic study of horror games is expanding, with researchers analyzing the precise mechanisms by which games like Resident Evil manipulate psychology. This scholarly attention provides valuable insights for designers and reveals the sophistication of the psychological engineering these games represent. Understanding horror gaming as a form of applied psychology and neuroscience elevates it from simple entertainment to a legitimate area of scientific inquiry. The therapeutic potential of controlled horror exposure is being investigated more seriously. Could experiences like Resident Evil, with their sustained but ultimately safe fear experiences, help individuals build emotional resilience? Could they provide a training ground for stress management and emotional regulation? The same psychological mechanisms that create entertainment value might also have clinical applications, though significant research is needed to understand the parameters and limitations of such therapeutic use. The future of horror will likely involve increasingly sophisticated understanding and manipulation of human psychology. Resident Evil pioneered an approach to sustained terror that moved beyond simple shock tactics to comprehensive psychological engineering. As neuroscience advances and game design becomes more psychologically informed, we can expect horror experiences of unprecedented sophistication and intensity. But this advancement brings responsibility. As we gain more powerful tools for manipulating fear and stress responses, we must consider the ethical implications and potential harms. The goal should be creating meaningful, memorable experiences that challenge and engage players without crossing into psychological harm. Resident Evil's lasting legacy may ultimately be not just the games themselves, but the design philosophy they represent, a blueprint for creating deep, sustained psychological impact through thoughtful manipulation of sound, space scarcity, and the fundamental mechanisms of human fear. The true measure of Resident Evil's psychological impact isn't found in the moments of active gameplay, but in the lasting impression it leaves on players' minds. The series has created what we might call a psychological footprint, a pattern of neural associations, conditioned responses, and emotional memories that persist long after the console is powered off. Understanding this enduring impact reveals the depth of the series' psychological sophistication. Players decades removed from their first Resident Evil experience can still feel a visceral reaction to the save room theme, to the sound of shuffling zombies, to the sight of narrow corridors in dim light. These aren't just nostalgic memories, they're conditioned fear responses that remain encoded in the amygdala and hippocampus, proving that the emotional learning the games facilitate is remarkably durable. The series doesn't just scare you in the moment, it creates lasting psychological structures that can be reactivated by associated stimuli years later. This lasting impact speaks to the power of emotional memory formation under stress. The heightened arousal during frightening gameplay moments causes the brain to encode those experiences with unusual vividness and durability. These memories resist the normal degradation that occurs with most gaming experiences. You might forget the specific puzzles you solved or the exact layout of certain areas, but the emotional content, the fear and tension and relief remains remarkably accessible. The series has also influenced how players approach fear more generally. Many report that Resident Evil changed their relationship with horror media, either increasing their appetite for intense experiences or establishing a benchmark against which other horror is measured. This psychological recalibration suggests the games don't just create fear, they shape fear processing itself, potentially altering how the brain evaluates and responds to threatening stimuli across contexts. The community that has formed around Resident Evil demonstrates the social dimension of the psychological impact. Shared fear experiences create strong social bonds. Players who have survived the Spencer Mansion or escaped Raccoon City share a kind of psychological kinship, having endured similar emotional ordeals. This communal aspect transforms individual psychological experiences into collective cultural memory, amplifying and extending the impact beyond single playthroughs. The speedrunning and challenge run communities represent an interesting psychological phenomenon. Players who have mastered their fear responses enough to optimize routes and minimize completion times demonstrate the brain's remarkable ability to adapt to and even neutralize repeated stressors. But even these expert players often report that certain moments retain their psychological power, suggesting some fear responses resist complete extinction through exposure. The modding communities and fan creations extend the psychological impact in fascinating ways. By creating new scenarios, new enemies, new environments within the Resident Evil framework, fans are essentially conducting psychological experiments, testing which elements of the formula are essential to the fear experience and which can be modified or removed. This crowdsourced psychological research has generated insights that have arguably influenced professional game design. The crossover of Resident Evil into other media, films, novels, comics, extends the psychological footprint into new domains. While these adaptations rarely capture the sustained terror of the games, they keep the psychological associations active in players' minds, preventing the fear memories from fading through disuse. The transmedia presence ensures that the neural pathways activated by the original games remain accessible and reinforced. The critical and academic analysis of Resident Evil as psychological, horror has created a meta-layer of engagement where players analyze their own fear responses. This reflexive awareness doesn't necessarily diminish the fear, but it changes its character. Understanding why you're afraid can coexist with still being afraid, creating a sophisticated dual processing where emotional and analytical systems operate simultaneously. The series' influence on aspiring game developers represents another form of lasting psychological impact. Countless designers cite Resident Evil as formative, shaping their understanding of what games can achieve psychologically. This influence propagates through the industry, with the psychological principles pioneered by Resident Evil appearing in diverse titles across genres, extending the series' psychological legacy far beyond its own installments. The personal narratives players construct around their Resident Evil experiences demonstrate how the games become integrated into identity and self-concept. "I survived Resident Evil" becomes a badge of psychological resilience, a story people tell about themselves that reinforces certain self-perceptions. The games provide challenges that feel meaningfully difficult, not just mechanically, but psychologically, and overcoming them creates genuine sense of accomplishment and growth. The way Resident Evil experiences resurface in dreams reveals the depth of the psychological encoding. Many players report nightmares featuring elements from the games, evidence that the fear content has been processed deeply enough to integrate into unconscious mental activity. These dream intrusions typically diminish over time, but can persist for years in some individuals, indicating genuine psychological impact that extends into the deepest levels of mental processing. The physiological conditioning created by Resident Evil can manifest in unexpected contexts. Players report increased startle responses to sudden sounds in daily life, heightened vigilance when entering dark or enclosed spaces, and even mild anxiety when hearing sounds similar to those featured in the games. These generalized responses suggest the conditioning extends beyond specific game-related stimuli to more abstract associated categories. The therapeutic potential of mastering fear through Resident Evil represents an underexplored dimension of the psychological impact. For some players, successfully navigating the game's sustained terror provides genuine confidence in their ability to manage fear and stress. This confidence can transfer to real-world situations, suggesting that controlled exposure to intense virtual fear might have stress inoculation benefits that extend beyond the gaming context. The nostalgia many players feel for Resident Evil is psychologically complex, mixing genuine positive memories with recollections of fear and distress. This suggests that the psychological impact includes not just the negative emotions of terror, but also the positive emotions of mastery, accomplishment, and the peculiar pleasure some individuals derive from safely experiencing fear. The full emotional spectrum creates a richer, more memorable psychological footprint than single-valence experiences. The way parents who played classic Resident Evil games approach sharing the experience with their children reveals interesting intergenerational psychological dynamics. Many are hesitant, remembering their own intense reactions and wondering if they should expose young players to similar stress. Others eagerly introduce their children, viewing it as a rite of passage or a bonding experience through shared fear. These decisions reflect deep consideration of the psychological impact and its appropriateness for developing minds. The preservation of physical media related to Resident Evil, collector's editions, merchandise, original consoles, represents an attempt to anchor and preserve the psychological experiences associated with the games. These objects serve as material mnemonics, triggering memories and emotional responses when encountered. The care with which collectors maintain these items suggests they recognize their psychological value, their ability to serve as portals back to significant emotional experiences. The impact of Resident Evil on broader cultural perceptions of zombies and survival horror cannot be overstated. The series helped define modern zombie horror aesthetics and narratives, creating templates that extend far beyond gaming into film, television, and literature. This cultural influence means that encountering zombie media in any format can trigger associations with Resident Evil, extending the psychological reach of the series into broader horror culture. The ongoing development of new Resident Evil titles ensures that the psychological impact remains fresh and evolving rather than purely historical. Each new installment introduces the series' particular brand of sustained terror to new players, while offering veterans updated experiences that reactivate old fear responses in new contexts. This continuity creates a living psychological tradition that spans generations of players and decades of development. Resident Evil's psychological impact ultimately demonstrates that games can create emotional and neurological experiences of genuine depth and lasting significance. The series proves that carefully designed interactive experiences can manipulate psychology with precision and power, creating sustained emotional states that leave measurable psychological footprints. This isn't just entertainment, it's applied psychology, using the unique affordances of interactive media to create experiences that engage mind and body in ways passive media cannot match. This sustained terror of Resident Evil works because it understands fear at a fundamental level. It recognizes that true horror isn't about moments of shock, but about states of dread. That resource scarcity creates more anxiety than resource abundance ever could provide security. That environmental design can make space itself threatening, and that sound often terrifies more effectively than sight. By manipulating these elements with sophistication and restraint, the series creates psychological experiences that endure because they tap into the deepest, most primitive aspects of human neurology. As we look to the future of horror gaming and interactive fear experiences more broadly, Resident Evil stands as both inspiration and benchmark. Its psychological blueprint reveals what's possible when designers truly understand the mechanisms of fear and commit to sustained psychological manipulation rather than cheap thrills. The series demonstrates that the scariest games aren't those that make you jump, but those that make you dread, that create persistent psychological states where fear becomes not an event but an environment, the atmosphere you inhabit and that inhabits you, leaving traces in your neural architecture that persist long after the screen goes dark.